All right, well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the second of our spring 2023 Kessler Conversations. We're focused this semester on the topic printed text and hypertext, technological and social change. My name is Bo Adams, and I have the great privilege of serving as director of Pitt's Theology Library here at Emory University, which is the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. For the past 3 years, these Kessler Conversations have presented opportunities to interview some of the top scholars in Reformation studies, in early modern history, and in art history, to explore how the books, the figures, and the conversations of the 16th century in Europe might be relevant to communities today. Today, I'm excited to welcome an early modern scholar who is, in fact, our first librarian to join us, so that's very exciting. The Reverend Dr. Pearce Carefoote retired in 2021 as the head of the Department of Rare Books and Special Collections at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto, which of course is one of the great rare book libraries here in North America. Beyond his development and growth of this incredible institution and his teaching at Toronto's Knox College, Dr. Carefoote is a scholar in his own right. His areas of academic training and research include books in the Middle Ages and the Reformation, and he's written important works on the history of the book and the role of books and print technology in the European Reformations. His work also focuses on the history of literary censorship, and I commend to you his 2007 book, Forbidden Fruit, Banned, Censored, and Challenged Books from Dante to Harry Potter, which sadly seems to be more relevant today than ever. In addition to being an accomplished scholar and a librarian, Dr. Carefoote also serves as an ordained priest in the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. So given this bio, I think you can see that he's an excellent person to help us understand the use of images in the books of the 16th and 17th centuries, and to help us reflect on how similar uses of propaganda surround us in today's media. So Dr. Carefoote, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, particularly during Holy Week.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking me.
So I want to remind all those who are joining us live online that you too can participate. And so as Dr. Carefoote and I have a conversation, if you do have questions, please include them in the chat below. And if we do have time at the end, I will relay them along. But with that, I'd like to get started, which is kind of a general question about images in books, which is going to be our topic today. So you chose to title our conversation, quote, Printed Imagery and Propaganda in 16th and early 17th century books. Now, me personally, I tend to think about propaganda in terms of textual or oral arguments, but you're focusing on images that appear in a lot of the books that we have, for example, here in our Kessler collection. So can you start by helping us understand a bit about the development of images in books in the 16th and 17th centuries?
Absolutely. And imagery has always been a popular feature of books, even in the medieval manuscript era. I think we can all think of medieval manuscripts that are illuminated and that sort of thing. But even in those medieval books, there are attempts to sway people's attitudes about certain people, certain issues of the day. This becomes all the more important once we get to printed books themselves. Now, the actual technique in terms of being able to have illustrations in printed books in some ways becomes much easier, obviously. You don't have the labor-intensive activity associated with painting, for example, in a medieval manuscript. Now you have more mechanical ways of being able to get images in. And in the period that we're mostly dealing with in the 16th century, that is going to mean woodcuts. And so you can see in the illustration that I have here on the left-hand side of the screen, this is from 1568 of a typical woodcutter who is using a gouge, a knife, on probably either a piece of fruit wood or perhaps on beech wood, something that he would be able to gouge out the wood, so that what you were creating is a relief technique, which you would then be able to insert with type, because type is also relief when you think about it, so that what is left carved at the top is the thing that is going to ink. And one of the things that book producers liked was that you could use this together with type because it could be printed at exactly the same time. You could put a wood block in with the type, ink the whole thing, and it was a pretty easy way of being able to get images out in multiple copies, which obviously you didn't have in the medieval manuscript tradition. On the right-hand side, you'll see that by the end of the 16th century, they are moving into other techniques for inserting images into books. And that is going to be an intaglio technique, which means carving into metal, most often copper. And then what actually gets pressed or printed is what the ink, where the ink settles in the grooves. Now that's going to be more problematic because it's not a relief technique. It's going to have to go through a separate press, but you're going to end up with a much finer image than you would with the woodcut. Either way, the important thing is that by the late 15th century and certainly in the 16th century, illustrations are becoming very common parts of book production throughout Europe, and certainly during the period of the Reformation.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that technique. I have to remind myself when I see these stunning images in these books that these were carved into a piece of wood. It's quite remarkable. I mean, you think about some incredible masters like Dürer and these kinds of images.
Absolutely.
Just stunning to think they were carved. Yeah. So given the techniques, we're going to talk about the types of images. So I presume, like we talked about with the medieval, lots of times we view these images as decoration. But of course, we're talking about images as propaganda. So can you provide us some examples from early parts of the Reformation where images are used not simply to decorate books, but in fact to reinforce or to send the message of the text itself?
That's right. So you'll find that images are already being used. The example there I have on the left-hand side is from the Divine Comedy, 1481, lovely woodcut. But you're also going to find that imagery is found in things like, and propaganda are going to be found in things like printers' devices. So you have that one right in the middle there. Robert Etienne, one of the great printers of the Reformation at Geneva, he has this image which, for those of who could actually interpret the image, would realize that this is advocating for the scripture, probably represented by St. Paul on the right there, over the cleverness of theologians. And so it's a very complicated printer's device. Nonetheless, it was an effective one. And then on the right, you have, and I'll come back to this later, you have what's called a passepartout title page. And if you look at that, that's from one of Luther's early works. But you'll see that it's a bit of propaganda, which I'll come back and talk about a little bit later. But this is really where we start to begin to see imagery being used in ways other than just to be able to say, isn't this a nice illustration to go along with the text? It's far more than that, really.
Yeah, no, that's so helpful. I mean, you think about something like the ATN printer's device, it seems like just a simple image, right? Maybe even a biblical image, but there's so much more going on there. And we need an expert like you to help us unpack that.
Absolutely. I mean, it was criticized even at the time by some people who said, how many people are really going to understand what you're trying to say? But once you start to examine it, you can see, okay, I see what he's doing. Yeah.
Well, let's take that as a cue. I mean, you and I have had a conversation before, and it's really helpful to have you walk through a particular image to understand what's going on. And so maybe for our audience, if you would, could you take a particular image, maybe one of these complex images, and help us see the powerful rhetorical devices and techniques that are going on within a single image that, to the layperson like me, may just look like a basic title page image?
Absolutely. So one of the most famous title page images that we have is this. This is the image of that comes on the title page of the Great Bible that was first published in 1539. Now, to understand all this iconography that's going on in this very busy title page, you have to understand that Henry VIII, this is the first Bible that was authorized for printing in England. Henry VIII did not want the Bible in English. England, in fact, was the very last country in Europe to allow the Bible to be published in the vernacular. On the continent, it had already happened. So 1539 is really when you get the very first, and this is the example. So on the title page, this very busy title page, which some have said is by Holbein, I think we're safe to say it's Holbein-esque. But if you look at, I'm going to use my pointer here and see if I can. So there we go. Okay, so obviously we have Henry sitting right here. Now, if we use your imagination, you would realize that this figure is effectively supplanting the figure that would have been the Pope prior to this as the idea of the person who is supreme head of the church. Now, if you look really carefully, up over top of Henry's head, you have this figure here, which is God, or Christ in God. Given the size of how tiny Christ is here, I think that gives us some sense of the way in which even Henry himself thought of his relationship within the church and with regards to God. The key thing here is that he is now going to pass on to the people of England the word of God in their own language. And to do this, he will pass it on his right to Thomas Cranmer, who is depicted here. And on the left, he will give it to Thomas Cromwell, the Lord Chancellor of England. And from them, the word gets passed on to bishops and priests on this side and to functionaries on this side. So it's very much a top-down movement that is that is happening here. If you look at it really carefully, by the time you get to the bottom of this imagery, here you have the rabble. And the rabble are incredibly thankful for the fact that Henry has actually given them the word of God. And for reasons that pass understanding, most of them are exclaiming out in Latin, Vivat Rex. There's only a few of them that say, God save the king. But this is the great thanksgiving of the ordinary people for all the wonderful things that Henry has done for them and giving them the book that he does not really want them to have. One of the other key things to notice in this imagery at the bottom here is no one is actually reading the Bible. The Bible is being given to them, preached to them by a minister here in the pulpit, because Henry, as we're going through the 1540s in particular, is going to start pulling back on who actually has the right to read the Bible. It begins with, it's only to be read by those who have gone to universities, either Cambridge or Oxford. It eventually gets taken away from women, and he starts to introduce that, even reading it to your staff is not necessarily something you should be doing. So it's an incredibly important iconography that we have going on in this one particular title page. Now, what's going to happen though is this title page, again, it's a passepartout. When I say passepartout, that means that the iconography, the wood block stays the same, but the title page information, which is in the middle here, gets altered as necessary. So you can keep the wood block. Now, from left to right here, you have the first edition, which we just looked at. On the right-hand side here, though, you have the fourth edition of 1540. And this is an important, again, iconographic detail, because you will notice that besides the title page information here in the middle, which has been altered from first edition, this fourth edition has one other very significant change. And you'll notice that on this side, at first edition, you have the Garter coat of arms of Thomas Cromwell. The right-hand side here, that Garter coat of arms has been removed. It's been lopped off from the woodblock. And the reason for that is because just before this Bible was reprinted, Cromwell himself was executed for heresy. Was the actual charge, probably more likely because he arranged the fourth disastrous marriage for Henry VIII that Henry did not want with Anne of Cleves. But aside from the fact if you don't want to ruin a perfectly good, beautiful wood block, it also sends a message to those who see this new title page, because even though they wouldn't know what Thomas Cromwell himself looked like, they could all interpret a coat of arms. And to see the coat of arms disappear from the title page says this is what happens to those who obviously defy the king. So a very important way in which you can use illustration as propaganda in the fairly early period of the Reformation in England.
Quite literally, he's been removed from the Book of Life. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this is also helpful when people always ask, why do you have to collect multiple editions of the same work? This is
absolutely. Yeah, no two are exactly the same. In rare book world, you want as many as you can get, especially in the early period like this.
Yeah. No, that's a really helpful explanation. So I think we can all start to see how these images are doing a lot more than decorating books. Our collection, of course, we're most interested in the Lutheran side of the early Reformation. Last month, we had a conversation with Andrew Pettigrew talking about imagery, and he was particularly talking about Luther's impact through his collaboration with some of the great master artists of the time. We talked a lot about Lucas Cranach.
Of course.
And one of the reasons that our Kessler Collection books exhibit so well is the plethora of what we shall call maybe creative imagery of some of the reformers' works. Luther and his colleagues are well known for very harsh images of their Catholic opponents. So can you talk in that context about some examples, or help us understand how images were used to kind of formulate Luther's theological program and propagandistic program?
Absolutely. So you saw this passepartout title page back a few minutes ago. Luther is brilliant in terms of knowing how to use imagery, as you say. And here, this is from 1521. This title page which gets reused multiple times for multiple books, just changing that internal cartouche part. It's used on pamphlets, it's used on large tomes, it's used on smaller books. But what you're seeing here is Luther reaching into the past and saying, I am part of the tradition. And so you will see here Peter at the top, you'll see Paul at the bottom, you'll see the symbols of the four evangelists in the corners, and you'll see the fathers of the church, Gregory the Great, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, John Chrysostom, all depicted on this title page. This is Luther saying to anyone who's going to look at these books, I am part of the tradition. But at the same time, Luther is going to use images to be able to take a poke, take a swipe at the church, at the Catholic Church. And among these, the most evocative, scandalous images that you have are these ones that came out from 1545. This is what Luther writes against the Pope. It's one of the last treatises that he writes, 1545. These images were probably created by Cranach, we know by Cranach, in order to support the text, but they were also printed as individual broadsides as well. And what you see here are pretty scatological, certainly offensive materials at the point in which Luther, any kind of reconciliation between Luther and Rome was now impossible. And so you see, for example, here on the left-hand side, you have the papal throne, the Pope sitting right here. And he's sitting on a throne which is made up of the jaw of hell, and he's attended by demonic demons wearing tonsures, so obviously referring to those who are part of the clerical community, monastic community of the Catholic Church. On the right-hand side, you get into more of the scatological material. You have two German peasants here who, for lack of a better term, are breaking wind in the face of the Roman pontiff, taking down their breeches and breaking wind. It gets even worse when you look at this right-hand one, where you have, again, a German peasant who is defecating into the papal crown, 1545. And here on the other side, you have a she-devil who is giving birth to cardinals, the Pope, from her anus. These are, and you can see here the Pope being suckled by another she-devil. These were incredibly disgusting imagery, but Luther knew that these had power for people, especially those who were not literate. They could look at these images, they could interpret for themselves. And Luther even felt that even these didn't go far enough. I'm just going to quote, he writes to another theologian, Reformed theologian at the time, Nicholas von Amsdorf, and he writes to him that Cranach, as far as he was concerned, he says, could have represented the Pope in a more appropriate, that is to say, more diabolical fashion, but you can judge that for yourself. So clearly, even though this is pretty outrageous, Luther still didn't think this had gone far enough.
Yeah, it's remarkable to see some of these images. We think things have gotten polarized in our own time, right? This is quite a different level here.
This is the beginning of political cartooning when you think about it.
No, that's absolutely right. We always talk about our 1521 Passionale Christi as the first kind of Reformation political book, or, you know, it is really using imagery to separate people. You and I have looked at some images that I think are maybe less obvious, that require a little more interpretation of this. So I'm thinking you and I talked, for example, about the famous monster of Rome in the Tiber River, where you got to kind of have imagery of animals and very extreme images. So can you help us understand some of these stranger images and how they tied into this same kind of rhetoric?
Sure. So obviously, what the Lutheran movement at its most propagandistic, or its when things are most polarized, are going to try to portray the Roman Church in the worst possible light, and as we see here, is going to try to portray Luther in the absolute best possible light. But one of the images that really comes out is, as you say, the monster of Rome. Now, supposedly, the story goes 1496. There are a huge series of floods that take place in Rome. And at the end of these floods, once the waters have subside, they find the body of this monster in the mud of the Tiber. And as you can see here, it has the head of an ass. It has the breasts and the torso of a female. It has one hand that is an elephant's trunk, one foot that is cloven, you can see here, another foot that is a claw. And you can, this isn't the greatest image. This is from the Fisher collection, but I hope you'll be able to see right here. You have the head of a satanic-looking character, the face of a man with horns, out of which comes a dragon's tail, at the end of which you have a serpent. And the whole thing is covered in black scales. Now, this was taken, of course, such a thing never happened, but this kind of story spread at the end of the 15th century as things were starting to get dicey in terms of unity within the church. And in the Moravian community, you have the first images of this idea of the monster of Rome that appears as early as 1498. And it was said to indicate that the Roman church was clearly not only in decline, but was about to collapse, that this was the omen that was associated with it. Melanchthon picks up on this. 1523, he publishes a book that is about this subject as well. So it reproduces itself numerous times in numerous places, books, pamphlets, broadsides, as a way of poking the eye of the Roman Church and helping to begin a movement of saying, not all is well in Rome, and this is our evidence for it. And of course, no one is really going to question the evidence at this point. I'm sure, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure some would, but some will just take this at face value and say, this is indicative of everything that's wrong with Rome at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you see this not only taking biblical imagery, but taking mythological imagery, taking animal imagery, and kind of applying them to historic figures that you and I also talked about. This often gets used in kind of depictions of the world, right? So we talked about Sebastian Münster's cosmography, right? Where he uses these exotic looking beasts, not to describe church figures, but to describe parts of the world unknown. Oh, you have the image here, yeah.
Yeah, here we have, exactly, yeah. Münster's Cosmographia of 1550, that image is from that one. And on the right-hand side, you have the, from 1493, the incunable Liber Chronicarum, which has these same beasts, crazy, outrageous imagery that in both cases, and this is where the propaganda part is so important, in both cases, these are depicting what you will find if you go beyond the bounds of Europe. Now, I've shown these images to students before at the University of Toronto, and they find them amusing until you start to say to them, now imagine what effect that has on readers if they think this is what you find once you get beyond quote unquote civilization. And what effect has that had over the centuries on the way in which we interact with people in Africa, in Asia, and ultimately in the New World? This isn't just funny pictures. This really does have an effect on and alters the mindset on the way we think about people beyond our borders.
Yeah, the cosmography is so interesting. It's a massive book, and it starts focused on Europe, but the further and further away from Europe, the stranger and stranger the images get. And it's exactly to your point of you should be fearful of these foreign lands.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
So some of the books that we kind of known for this era kind of become famous for the images themselves. So an example that might be familiar to many of us in the English-speaking world would be Fox's Book of Martyrs, where you have depictions of horrific deaths and interestingly, deaths of those who are considered one's own theological forebears. So how do these kinds of images function within a kind of theological propaganda setting?
Yeah, so I'm assuming a lot of people know what we call Fox's Martyrs, Book of Martyrs. The actual title, as you see there, Acts and Monuments of These Latter and Perilous Days, first published in 1563. In the end, John Fox, who was more in the Calvinist tradition, Englishman, he creates this, for lack of a better word, a mythology, in a sense, that is using this book to argue that England had always been Protestant, even before the time of Augustine of Canterbury, which of course is a complete anachronism. But he is trying to communicate the idea that Rome has always been the enemy of English Christians. And so he goes back to the very beginning. He goes back to St. Alban the Martyr, and he over decades he expands on this book. And what he does is he links the trials of English Protestants, especially under Queen Mary, and to the sufferings of Protestants on the continent, but ultimately back to the sufferings of the first Christian martyrs. And this book expands eventually to 2 million words. It was one of the biggest printing projects in Reformation print history. But one of the things that were most important about it was that despite the injunction against the use of imagery in the Calvinist tradition, there were times when obviously it was beneficial. And so they put aside their concerns about, the second commandment, and they started to introduce imagery into the Fox's Martyrs. And so you will see the deaths of innocents in the worst possible ways, often by fire, but in other ways as well, by beheading and other cruelties. This book went through countless editions from the 16th century right through to the 20th century. And there was a period, certainly into the 20th century, when any English Protestant home, you could almost count on them having two books, the Bible and Fox's Martyrs. So these had a huge influence on the way in which English Protestants thought about themselves. There was also a realization that for those who didn't read the book, you could still have the imagery. And so these images were printed as standalone broadsides, often would be purchased and then framed and put up in kitchens of ordinary English Protestants, I suspect also in North America, to remind children of everything that their ancestors had suffered for their faith, and also of the depredations of the Church of Rome. So it was an enormously influential book.
Yeah, I can't imagine it'd be a fun image to have in your kitchen, but yeah,
but
certainly make the point. So we've talked a lot about reformers in Germany. We've talked about reform movements in England and their use of images. But I presume this was not a rhetorical strategy solely reserved for the reform movements. So can you talk a little bit about Catholic imagery and the use of visual propaganda within that tradition, or as a response to what the Protestants were doing?
Absolutely. So the Catholics, interestingly, were a little slow on the uptake to take on the ability of imagery to work in their favor, given how important iconography is within the Catholic tradition. But it does start to happen. And so you do find that by the second half of the 16th century, you were finding more and more imagery that supports the Catholic cause. Here you have an image that was designed by a Franciscan friar whose name was Johann Nassus. And it takes the imagery of beasts and animals, and which the Lutherans we've already seen have been using against Roman Catholicism, and are now going to use it against Lutherans. And so it's Lutherans attempting to celebrate sacred mysteries like the Eucharist that you see in the bottom left, preaching in the bottom right, the use of holy water in the top left, all these things that are being aped, if you will, by animals rather than by human beings. And this does have influence on, it's using the same imagery as the Protestants, but this is going to have an influence within Catholic territory in an anti-Lutheran, anti-Calvinist tone as well. It's not going to be just, we have to bear in mind that this imagery comes from somewhere. And there has been it's not just coming from as a reaction against Protestantism or imitating Protestant caricatures. It's also coming out of the tradition of martyrdom that has been a long, long history within the Roman Catholic tradition. And so you see here, for example, these are Renaissance Reformation frescoes that were done in the Chapel of San Stefano Rotondo in Rome. If you ever get the chance to see them, it's one of these churches off the beaten track in Rome that most people don't go to, but they are the most amazing images of the executions of Christians. And the last 10 of them, perhaps, are images of Catholics who are being executed by Protestants. And Dickens, he sees these images in the 19th century, and he says he wrote that such a panorama of horror and butchery no man could imagine in his sleep, though he were to eat a whole pig raw for supper. This is how offensive these images were. Now, these particular images were painted on the walls of the German-Hungarian College, which was a college that was intended for seminarians who were going back to fight Protestantism in Germany and in the Hungarian territories. Similar images were painted on the walls of the English College in Rome, again, for English Catholic seminarians who would be going back to England to fight Protestantism. The problem with this kind of imagery, of course, is that it's limited. Unless you go into the church, it's not really going to have a huge effect on you. So the priests of the Venerable English College very wisely realized that, you know what, let's take the images that we have on our walls and we're going to turn them into a book. And so they did. And so in 1584, which, just bear in mind, is 4 years before the Spanish Armada, that's going to be important, they come out with this particular book, the Ecclesiae Anglicanae Trophaea, which is just the trophies of the English Church. And the first part of the book is all about the early English martyrs of the ancient times. But the last 10, I think it is, if it's 20, maybe 20, last 20 images of the book are all depicting the executions of Tudor martyrs at the hands of Henry or of his son Edward or under Elizabeth I. And they're amazing images, and you can see that they have a key that goes with them, so that you can look at B here and find out what B relates to down here. And it's kind of a pastiche of different events happening at the same time. So you have the body of a friar hanging on the scaffold here, and then being taken down and disemboweled. Pretty gruesome stuff. But where the propaganda value of this comes in is when you look at these really, really closely, these images, you start to realize that the people who are tormenting the Catholics are dressed specifically in Roman dress. So it's to link these Tudor martyrs to the early martyrs of the church, in the same way that Fox was doing with Fox's Book of Martyrs. But the martyrs themselves and the people who are standing by watching are all dressed in Tudor garments. So it was a very clever, perhaps subconscious way of being able to communicate to viewers that the struggle of Roman Catholics in England is absolutely no different from the struggles of St. Lawrence or St. Agnes or St. Agatha, those early Christian martyrs, which the whole church still venerated.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I love the little key there to help people like me understand what's going on.
As long as you read Latin, it works well.
So, well, you're pushing us forward out of the early 16th century, which is lovely. And you've moved in your title for the talk, you've talked about shifts into the 17th century. So as we move along in time, as we get further and further from the era that we cover in the Kessler collection, do you see technological or rhetorical changes with images? Do things start to happen differently? You mentioned a technological shift to engravings, but how does this change?
Yeah, so for example, I'm going into the 17th century here just to show the way in which propaganda does start to alter. It's a very subtle alteration, but it's a real form of propaganda. And it's in this book where I think it's really, really clearly seen. The History of St. Paul's Cathedral, London, 1658. Now, we may think of the Reformation ending in it, technically it does end earlier than this, but we have to remember that in England, as is often the case, because England being on the edges of things, the Reformation is going on still. You have the Commonwealth period now, where the Puritans have taken over. The Church of England has been banned, and one of the results of this is this magnificent cathedral, which no longer stands, of course, St. Paul's Cathedral, the old St. Paul's Cathedral in London, is falling into disrepair. The Puritans don't know what to do with it. They don't care about it, and they are not going to repair it. And there's a man who comes along named William Dugdale, and Dugdale cared very much about this church. He was a royalist himself, which was a dangerous thing in 1658. He was a devout son of the Church of England. He did not hold with the Puritan reforms. And he effectively does this incredible book as an act of shaming, in a way, of what has happened to one of the greatest churches in Christendom. And he engages the services of a man named Wenceslaus Haller, who is arguably the greatest etcher of the 17th century. And Haller spends a very long period of time going all around old St. Paul's Cathedral and detailing the tombs, the side chapels, everything that relates to this incredible work. And as he's doing it, he knows that 1642, this church was shut during the as we're getting into the Commonwealth, towards the Commonwealth period, 1642. The church gets shut. The keys the doors are locked. And the building itself starts to fall into disrepair, so that when Haller is walking around it, one of the side chapels is being used as a bakery. The entire sanctuary area, the chancel at the end, has been walled off, and it's being used as a Puritan preaching house. The rest of the huge nave was being used as a stable for horses. There's a glass blower who was in another chapel. There's a wine cellar now in the crypt of the basement, and the south transept has already fallen down. And so Haller, who is as appalled by this, what has happened to the church under the Puritans as Dugdale is, creates this magnificent book. And you can see what I think is the finest etching of the whole work. This tunnel view of the interior of Old St. Paul's. And underneath it, he puts an inscription. I just want to see if so I can tell you what he writes. He says at the bottom in Latin, and this is taking a chance when you think that the Puritans are in charge. He says, Wenceslas Haller of Bohemia, sketcher and sometime admirer of this church, which is daily waiting to fall, has thus preserved its memory. May the mother church be revived and sacrilege perish, so that the ship of the church about to sink in the waves of time may be preserved through the saving auspices of God. And this was a dangerous thing to write. It was a dangerous thing to publish. And yet they did. And it remains, to my mind, I mean, it is the most important book on Old St. Paul's and what Old St. Paul's looked like, but also what Old St. Paul's stood for and what had happened to it. So this is propaganda of a different sort. One other bit of propaganda that, again, 17th century, but it's important, I think, for us to understand today. And that's because of the effect that it has here on us here in North America. The Jesuits in 1675 come out with this book, which talks about the Jesuit missions, which of course were incredibly important in the Reformation. So you're often detailing stories here that come from the 16th century, but being recorded in the 17th. And it's depicting the people to whom the missionaries go to catechize, but it depicts their martyrdoms in every case. And so it again propagates this idea of the savages to whom the church is committed. And this, of course, will have an effect on the way Europeans look at the New World, look at Asia. It reminds us again of what we saw in the Cosmographia and in the Liber Chronicarum. So the propaganda, image value of propaganda continues to the very end of what we could say the extended of the long Reformation period.
Yeah, no, it's helpful to remember. I mean, and of course we'll talk about the modern era, but the continuation of these techniques and the way in which they function as the theological conversations change, the images kind of go with them. So to return to this idea of some of these kind of grotesque or scatological images that you've talked about in the past, I want to draw upon your experience as a librarian here to ask about presenting images like this. You've mentioned before how heated the rhetoric was at the time, how controversial these images would have been. But even in our contemporary conversations, there might be trouble or offense caused by displaying these images in a modern gallery or in a modern work. So how do you as a library professional think about the public display of images that were certainly powerful in a kind of grotesque way in the past, but might likewise be so now?
Well, absolutely. When we acquired those, the anti-papal caricatures from the Lutheran 1545s, when I first showed them to our chief librarian, because they were to go up on the walls, all of them, the whole set of them were to go up on our walls for our Reformation exhibition. And he was a little concerned. He said, people are going to be offended by these images. And my argument back was, well, then if that happens, in a sense, they've achieved what their intention was. And so, but the whole point is that when you present material like this, you present it within its context. And so you have to make sure that people are understanding what the aim of the caricatures was in the first place, and also to make that connection between, say, offensive images of the 16th century to something like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons that caused, the deaths of cartoonists in Paris not so long ago. There was this continuation of imagery being offensive to people, and people understand that some images are meant to be offensive, and human beings have the right to be offended, then I think they understand that it doesn't mean that we should censor those images, that this is the room where we have discussion and conversation about what this means, not only in the past, but also what it means for us today. And as a result, we didn't have a single complaint in the 6 months that exhibition was on, not a single complaint. I've had complaints about other things before, but not a single thing about those particular images.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And museum and exhibition work, like providing context is the key, but to be bold to allow the images to function as they were designed to. So if we shift, I mean, to continue to talk about the modern implications of this, I mean, obviously we live in a world where propaganda is all around us, and in some sense we recognize it immediately. In some sense it's more subtle, like some of these images that you've described. So I'm curious how you, as somebody who's clearly thought a lot about the way that imagery makes points, right? The way that it functions rhetorically. How do you look at our media ecosystem today, particularly in North America? And do you see some of these same types of moves functioning that functioned so powerfully 500 years ago?
Absolutely. If anything, I think it's functioning even more strongly than it did 500 years ago. And it's a result of us living in a social age. We're still in a very much a Wild West world when it comes to the way in which images now are being accessible through social media. Now, we know obviously that, like Facebook and Instagram and that sort of thing, they have monitors who look at images that go up, but that doesn't mean that, things that are untrue, patently untrue, manipulated, aren't getting out there and are affecting the way in which people view reality. Up north of the border here, we are very concerned about the way in which propaganda is affecting our elections. It's a great concern. There are now commissions that are going on at the highest levels of government to look at the way in which social media, imagery associated with social media, has affected the outcome of elections. So this is not a small matter. Memes, which we look at and we think of, aren't they funny? Memes can have a huge effect on the way in which people's mindsets are formed, or subconsciously how they react to information. I found it very interesting. I'm sure, like a lot of you, yesterday I was watching the news and seeing what was happening in New York, and it was interesting when they came out that one of the things that came up, of all things, was a particular meme related to the former president and how it had been manipulated, and what this means in terms of how people receive information. So I think the idea of the way in which imagery and social media is having a pervasive effect across the board on our politics, on the evolution of our society, is something we have to be aware of. And I think it has to make us think more carefully about our sources, whether or not they are factual, how to determine that they are factual, how to determine what is reliable, what is not reliable. And we're not there yet. This is still a new world for us. And I just hope we can get a handle on it before things spin a little too much out of control.
Yeah. No, it gets a little terrifying when images can be so manipulated, and deep fakes and that whole conversation. So I think it's important to recognize that this kind of visual propaganda has been going on for a very long time. So let me again draw upon your experience as a rare book librarian. I always ask our guests to talk about the value of rare book collecting in a digital age. I suspect this will be an easy question for you. But we've had the benefit of, through digital technology, seeing all of these images that you've shared with us. And so one might argue, sure, we've digitized all these things, so there should be less of an emphasis on collecting and preserving these things now that we have the digital surrogates. How do you, as a rare book librarian, square the work you've been doing with the power of the digital age?
Well, I mean, the digitization of materials is crucial right now. There's no question about it, because we discovered that, especially in rare book institutions, we really discovered the importance of that during COVID. Obviously, we've been digitizing before that, but the way in which we were able to deliver to our public was through digitization. The thing, however, is that a digital image is intended to be a surrogate. It is not intended to be a replacement. And that's where the rare book librarian, the special collections director, will have to stand up and say, no, the artifact matters. And the reason the artifact matters, there are numerous reasons, but among them is, again, talking about context. Whether you're talking about a great big huge folio book or a miniature book on a screen, they look exactly the same. You lose all sense of perspective when you don't have the artifact to be able to consult, and the way in which that the artifact was used by readers in history. I mean, one of the areas of specialization that's growing right now is the history of readership, and so it's very important that we be able to preserve the artifacts of the past that will inform us about how books were used. Another reason why it's important that we maintain libraries of physical items is because of what we call the association value of books. So you may have multiple copies of, say, Copernicus, for example, his De Revolutionibus. But one of the copies that we have at the Fisher is heavily annotated. Now, you have to remember that this is the first book that is going to advocate the idea of the sun as the center of the solar system. Well, this is an incredibly new idea in the middle of the 16th century, right? So to have a book that is completely annotated all over it by someone who's trying to engage with this radical idea is beyond price. This is the witness of someone working through a thought process, someone who is long dead. Otherwise, we would have no record of how an ordinary person thought about this new idea. So the association value is incredibly important, but it's also just the tactile ability to handle material. I think there is a psychological difference between the way, and the studies have shown there is a psychological difference between the way in which we handle material in our hands or on our desk, turning a page, feeling it, smelling it, seeing it within its size and its context, that has a different effect on our psychology and the way in which we understand information. So from my point of view, the digital and the artifact must be complementary to one another. It's not one or the other. We need both in order to maintain proper special collections in the 21st century and going forward.
Oh, I completely agree. And in fact, that what you're talking about there, that kind of experience has been heightened, I would say. When visitors come to our library now and see real artifacts, when they've been acculturated by a digital age, it almost heightens the experience of seeing the real thing. The other point I try to always mention to people, it's important that these books are 500 years old, but that 500 years itself is really important. Where they've been, who's owned them, and who's touched them is a part of the book story. So yeah, I suspected you and I would agree on this, but this is good to hear. We're coming up at the very end of our time. I do have one question, and it's asked from one of my colleagues here at Emory, so I want to relay it to you, and you can give it a shot now, but if you have thoughts on it later, I'll be happy to get you in touch with her. So Deanna Womack, who teaches here at the School of Theology, she says, quote, "I'm interested in Reformation era images of Islam and Muslims, and if you can speak to this, I wonder which images you would consider most influential or widespread. There are images of various Muslim groups in the Cosmographia and Fox's Book of Martyrs, also included in the history of the Turks. What other images of Islam should we be aware of in this period?"
So one of the ones that I would suggest I'm not sure if it's still up on the screen or not, but the Tanner book, the Societas Jesu, it also has images of Muslims during this period, mostly 16th, early 17th century, depictions of martyrdoms, principally of the Jesuits at the hands of Islam. They're well, I think the one on the right, as a matter of fact. Yes, the one on the right. Is it still up on the screen?
It is.
Okay, yeah, so the one on the right is one of those depictions. So this is because pretty much every other page of the Tanner book here has these incredible engravings on it. You will find all sorts of images that relate to Islam. That's the one that has always impressed me the most. I would have to go back and look through we have our growing collection of Islamic materials, and I'll check in with our librarians responsible for that and see if he can suggest any others. But I would strongly recommend that you look at the Tanner.
Well, that's wonderful. I know Dr. Womack will appreciate that, and I will certainly get her in touch with you. We're just over time, which is okay, because we could go forever. I would very much enjoy that. But Dr. Carefoote, thank you so much for your work, of course, but also for the time that you spent with us, again, particularly during Holy Week, where you yourself are very busy. So I very much appreciate that.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yep, and I want to remind everybody here, we will edit this recording, get it up online, just like all of our other Kessler Conversations. And next month, we will be joined by an art historian, Dr. Jenny Spinks from the University of Melbourne. and our attempt to internationalize our Kessler Conversations this semester. So this has been a great pleasure. Dr. Carefoote, again, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.